I operated a photographic studio in Santa Barbara, California. I had a good reputation for being very technically competent, and people would bring me challenging things to photograph, intraocular lenses that get implanted in the eye, something really tiny. And I mastered the technology, so I knew how to photograph these things. And so I was contacted by a local company, Information Sciences, I believe they were called. They were a contractor to Los Alamos National Laboratory. And the guy I worked with, Don Devan, was an imaging scientist, not a photographer, but an imaging scientist. And they were doing a project for Los Alamos that had to do with atomic bombs. What a surprise.
Oh, wow.
And they needed somebody with not only photographic experience, but a darkroom experience to create a series of images from old unclassified 35 millimeter motion picture films of above ground atomic explosions. And with their fancy computers that they had at Los Alamos, they were able to get new information out of these old unclassified films, like thermal gradients within a mushroom cloud, stuff like that. So they came to me, and I had, over a period of 7 months, I had to make prints of these and superimpose kilometer scales. And remember, all this is done prior to digitals. It was all done analog in the darkroom. And that was a 7-month project. And at the end of that project, we finished. Then a few weeks later, Don Devan, same gentleman, called me again. And you know, when you're self-employed and the phone rings, you're praying, maybe that's the next project. So when Don and I finished, I thought that was the end of it. When he called me again, I got excited, thinking it's another project for Los Alamos. And he said, well, not exactly. He said, what do you know about the Shroud of Turin? And that's when I laughed. I said, but Don, I'm Jewish. And Don laughed and said, so am I, remember? Don was one of the other Jewish guys on our team. And Don explained to me that there was an instrument over at Sandia Laboratories called a VP8 image analyzer. A VP8 image analyzer was at Sandia Labs, was purchased by Bill Mottern, who was an X-radiography expert, and he was doing X-rays of classified stuff. Remember, both Los Alamos and Sandia are both weapons laboratories, so we can't talk too much about what was exactly going on. But they had this VP8, and Bill was using it to extract more data from his X-rays. Well, they decided to put a photograph from 1931 of the shroud into the VP8. Now, what the VP8 is, it's an instrument, looks like an old stereo tuner, basically, and the output of it is onto a green screen monitor, and the input is a black and white video camera, so you could focus it on anything and put it into a VP8 and see what you got. What the VP8 does, or allows, is it allows you to take the lights and darks of an image and stretch them into 3D vertical space proportionate to each other. So a normal photograph, you'll get a jumble of shapes, but nothing coherent. I mean, just a bunch of shapes. And they put the shroud image into this, and they got the natural relief of a human form, like a relief, like almost like a sculpture of a human form, of the entire body. And that means, from my photographic point of view, there had to be some correlation between the distance between the cloth and the body when the image formed and the density of the resulting image on the cloth. Where there was direct contact, tip of the nose, top of the hands, the image on the shroud is darkest. As the distance between the cloth and body increases, the image grows more faint until it reaches extinction at about 3.5 centimeters. Mm-hmm. Well, as soon as he told me that, I realized, well, wait a minute, photography and artworks don't do that. You're not going to get that. In a photograph, we imply depth and shape by highlights and shadows, but we're still working in a two-dimensional plane. Yeah. This has taken that two-dimensional image and stretching it into vertical 3D space, and we're getting this natural relief of a human form, which no other normal image would ever yield. And that was the catalyst. It was Don Devan, who was working at Los Alamos on his projects for Los Alamos, met up with John Jackson, and Eric Jumper and Bill Modern over at Sandia, and they took a shroud photo because Jackson had been studying the shroud since he was a kid, and he had gotten Don Devan involved a couple of years before that. I wasn't even aware of that at the time. And so once they saw this, Jackson and Jumper and Devan and the other guys who were there said, look, let's see if we can put a team together and see if we can get permission to go over there and try and figure out how this image was formed. Is it a painting? Is it a scorch? Is it a photograph? Is it a rubbing? What is it? And so the VP8 ultimately became the catalyst for the formation of the STURP team. And in my presentations, and you can find some of these on the internet, I actually show video taken right off the screen of a VP8 of one of my shroud photographs, and you can see this. And for comparison, I took a photo off the wall of my friend who had the VP8 of his grandkids, and we put that into the VP8, and you can see the distorted faces and mouths and nothing like what's on the shroud. So there is something unique about the image on the shroud that encoded spatial or topographic information into the density, the lights and darks of the image itself. And that's unique. That's the only image I've ever seen that has that property.